Welcome to the Futurati podcast. Any member of the Futurati is somebody who believes in the power of the future. We know there's a better world ahead, and we indeed have the power to make it so. In our podcast, we talk to the best minds in the world about the most urgent problems facing mankind today, and we hope you learn as much from them as we do. I'm Thomas Fry, a professional futurist and keynote speaker.
And I'm Trent Fowler, a machine learning engineer and author. Thank you for joining us. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for listening to the Futurati podcast. Tonight, we're joined by Kurtis Lockhart. Kurtis is a PhD candidate at Oxford and head of research at the Charter Cities Institute. His research interests focus on the political economy of development. Specifically, he's interested in how institutional reforms affect public goods provision in developing countries with an area focus on sub-Saharan Africa. If you enjoy this interview, please don't forget to like the episode and subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Kurtis, thanks so much for joining us on the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, guys. I'm excited to be here.
Why don't we start with getting a little bit of detail about your background and your interests and what brought you to working on these problems?
Yeah, so I'm in my PhD now, but it goes back to my earlier stint in grad school. I was interested in political decentralization. It came up a bunch in my coursework and then readings that I found very interesting, and in my conversations with smart people who I trusted. And so it was just in the ether, and I ended up doing my master's thesis on it and diving deeper into the literature. And I found it very convincing. Specifically, I was looking at this new constitution that was passed in Kenya in 2010, and then it was enacted in 2013. They created a whole new subnational layer of government in Kenya. So it was really centralized before this new constitution in the hands of the presidency. And then once it was enacted in 2013, these 47 county governments were created subnationally. So they're like US states. I'm from Canada, so Canadian provinces, Swiss cantons and these guys. And so I wanted to see how that impacted various public goods provision. And that thesis focused on roads, and now I've been investigating other things that were decentralized as well. So water and sanitation being one of them, and then some health services as well. So that's what I looked into. And then I went to Oxford to continue that. And I also, frequently read some blogs and whatnot on the blogosphere. And one of them is Tyler Cowen's Marginal Revolution. And this guy kept being posted. Back then it was called horrible name, the Center for Innovative Governance Research. I think it's what it was. I think so. The acronym is CIGAR. So we needed to change it. Yeah. Now we're CCI, which is better. So that kept coming up on the blog, and I was like, oh, this is interesting. And I clicked in and read a bit about Mark's work, some of his stuff, listened to his podcast, for example, on the 80,000 Hours podcast was great. And basically what charter cities were to me in my kind of mental state at the time was just the logical end of political decentralization, right? I was studying this regime in Kenya that was super centralized. Political authority was super centralized in kind of this one person, or at least the office of the presidency. And a charter city was saying, like, at the other end of the spectrum is this other thing where political power can be very much devolved to the city level, the local level, and that can result in a lot better outcomes. And that had kind of been justified by by the research and readings that I had been doing at the time. So that is a long-winded answer to that question.
Yeah. So do you have a secret goal of creating your own charter city? Is that what you're looking for?
Well, it's not so I wouldn't call it secret. That lends a sinister undertone to the thing. It's pretty out in the open. So we have a few projects on the go. So my research team, we kind of I see it as we have two arms pretty much. One is research. It's writing, either shorter things like blog posts or articles or longer papers, just setting the sort of intellectual foundations for this kind of idea. It's a bit wacky. It's a bit different from what a lot of folks in international development are used to hearing about poverty alleviation, right? And so you need to set a sort of mental model or framework for them to put this new idea on. So that's number one. And then number two is like technical assistance or consulting. So we do have several on the ground projects. One is in Zambia. It's in Kwashi. It's a city aimed to be for 100,000 residents, centered around a university. So the university is focused on STEM, science, technology, engineering, math, with the thought being that in Zambia, I mean, especially, I don't know if you guys know about the stuff going on in Zambia, but they're being kind of rocked. Their currency is severely devalued, and they have an election coming up in August that lends some more interesting chaos to the current situation. And basically what Moya, who's our partner on the Nkwashi project, sees this charter city as in Zambia is a way for students to come to this university, gain some STEM skills, and then get a position, working remotely for a tech company, say from Europe or from the States, and getting paid in euros or dollars in order to hedge against this currency with the kwacha, which is the Zambian currency. So that's the Zambia project. We have two projects in Nigeria. I won't go into every project. We have one kind of affiliated project in Honduras, and then a few more in the pipeline. So yeah, those are the two arms of research. So no secret projects. We try and be forthright about the stuff we're involved in.
Very nice. Are you gonna rule your charter city with an iron fist?
I hope to think that I'm above that. I hope to think that I'm better than that.
Everyone does.
Yeah.
So I want to go back to some of the research you did for your master's thesis and then your later PhD. So you said that you were focusing on decentralization and the impact of the provisioning of public goods. So could we just start with some definitions? So for the audience, could you define decentralization and I want to come back to that, and then public goods as well?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is good. So there's different types of decentralization. One, so it's from I'll go from weakest to strongest. One is delegation, which is just kind of, you have the folks at the center in the central government kind of just delegating authority to another central bureaucrat, but they're just located in the local area, right? So they just delegate things. Another is deconcentration. So you have the central government. They literally set up a branch of a central bureaucracy in a local area, and that branch is there, but it's still reporting upwards to the national government, right? So you have delegation, deconcentration, and then the biggest or strongest version of decentralization is called devolution, and that's where you actually, like Kenya did, create this whole new subnational layer of government that is kind of democratically elected, and therefore the officials that are put in place that are elected by that local area are accountable downwards. They're not answering up to the guys at the center anymore. They are accountable downwards to the folks locally.
So then are those people that live there, are they citizens of the charter city then? They're not citizens of the country?
Oh, well, he's just talking about decentralization as a concept, not specifically charter cities just yet.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I want to separate the two concepts. So charter cities is a form of decentralization that they'll require the host country to devolve a lot of authority down to the city level. In fact, we advocate for as much authority as the host country is willing to give, minus criminal law, constitutional law, and international treaties. We would like as much authority in other realms of law and regulation as possible devolved down. Whereas decentralization is just this, it's kind of this trend that's been occurring increasingly since the about 1980s, especially early 1990s, after that wave of democratization hit the world when the USSR fell. Sam Huntington called it the third wave of democratization in the 90s. And when they democratized, a lot of countries also decentralized, right? And so they are two separate, distinct things. And decentralization can either be implemented weakly with delegation and deconcentration, or strongly, like Kenya did for most things. It gets complicated, but
Right.
for most things, with devolution. Yeah.
How do you assess the amount of decentralization that's occurred? Is there an agreed upon metric for measuring that and tracking it over time?
No. The short answer is no. And this is why I'm not done my PhD yet.
Right.
Because this stuff is very tricky to, first of all, you have to kind of come up with a categorization or typology, right? To like make some definitions like we just did. And then you have to actually find the data, right? And so where I concentrate my research in is sub-Saharan Africa. A lot of the data, especially at the local level, is very, very poor.
Right.
And so you have to do a lot of searching. So short answer to your question is no, there's not a sort of standardized way to track the degree of devolution over time.
And all of your definitions seemed to still have rather a large role for the government, so that there might be, in the case of devolution, where there's a new sublayer set up that's democratically elected and beholden to the citizens, that it has to answer directly to them. But when I just sort of naively think of decentralization, I think of decisions that are not being made on a political level. So it seems like what you need is sort of a Gini coefficient for power, where you look at the extent to which a single individual is able to make decisions that affect lots of other people. And there might be some interesting tension between decentralization economically, where you've got lots of different firms in an industry making decisions, and then decentralization politically, where power is made in where decisions are made in units that are smaller and closer to the actual people.
Absolutely. So, I mean, you're right on the money to bring in the private sector into this, because privatization could be lumped in could be lumped into this spectrum.
That's how I think about it. Yeah.
Yes, I kept it political because that's kind of that's what my research focuses on is I'm getting a PhD in political science, right. So it has to focus on that. But privatization can definitely be lumped in. And so what we saw, I mentioned this third wave of democratization in the 1990s that had this accompanying trend towards decentralizing power. What we also saw in the 1990s was a ton of privatization. And there's this literature called the public administration literature, and is what it did. And I think this was kind of brought in by the Thatcher Reagan era of contracting out a lot of public services to the private sector. And it's this new form of public administration called new public management. And it became in vogue in the 90s. I think it's a little less in vogue now. But countries like New Zealand, for example, went full bore into this new public management and outsourced a lot of their public goods provision and public services to private sector entities.
How did that turn out for them? Do you happen to know?
I mean, they did quite well during COVID. So,
yeah.
I mean, as far as I can tell, Lord of the Rings did well. Jacinda Ardern is doing well. New Zealanders are doing fine. My research focuses on sub-Saharan Africa, so I don't really know how New Zealand has fared relative to what they were doing in the 90s, but all accounts I can see, they're doing just fine.
That's interesting. So that's sort of a third possibility between what's been mentioned so far. So you can have decisions that are made politically, you can have decisions that are made purely in the private sector, and then you can have political public decisions that are made by contracting out to the private sector. So you might get some efficiency, but it's not quite what you would get in just a raw free market where everything is coordinated by prices and undergirded by property rights.
Yeah, and this comes to public-private partnerships, right? Because these were also this hybrid form that's a mix of public and private, and there's a lot of benefits. Well, at least theoretically, to public-private partnerships. I think there are a few conditions that a jurisdiction needs to fulfill before they get the full benefits of PPPs. But just to go through some of them, like I'm thinking of public goods provision and especially infrastructure, because that's the one I've looked into the most. There are a lot of infrastructure PPPs that have happened, some of which have been very successful, some of which haven't. But some of the benefits are you have dedicated management that are experienced in my case, building roads and building toll roads and infrastructure. They've done this before, so they know how to do it. You have an incentive for this project to actually get started and get off the ground because these private entities want to start charging tolls, right? They don't get paid until they charge these tolls, so they don't want to keep the project in limbo for a whole ton of time or planning for a whole ton of time. It prevents white elephant projects, right? Because these projects only make money if the demand arises, right? They only make money if people are there to pay the toll. It prevents countries from having to set up a whole other bureaucracy dedicated to tracking and implementing this project over a long scale of time. And PPPs, private companies, if you bundle all of the parts of an infrastructure project, so that's everything from designing and the pre-planning, the build, the operation, and then the maintenance. If you bundle all of that, the whole life cycle of the project together, then maintenance decisions that affect maintenance costs will be incorporated into design decisions at the beginning. Whereas if you separate those things and segment them, and you have a different designer than the person or entity who's going to maintain it, the designer has no incentive to think about the maintenance guy, right? That's their problem.
The incentives are wrong, and there's no incentive to integrate all throughout the process.
The life cycle of the project, exactly. So PPPs tend to, at least in theory, be better at the maintenance side as well. So those are some of the benefits of this hybrid form. And another article of my research has to do with public-private partnerships when it comes to infrastructure in Nigeria. And so I've looked into this a bit, and one of the things that I'm running up against is for PPPs, at least in infrastructure, to be effective, it does require a bit of governance, a bit of state capacity on the part of the state, because you need in theory this public entity to hold and enforce the contract that the private sector has signed with the public sector, right? Someone needs to enforce that the terms of that contract are being adhered to by both parties. And typically that's a PPP unit, which is a public run agency. And so there does need to be some semblance of state capacity in order to get these things right, especially for larger projects.
One thing that I wanted to ask you, and we might lose some listeners here, but I like to read economics, and I've been going through the Marginal Revolution University courses on basic economics, and like they define a public good there as being non-rivalrous and non-excludable. And I've never really understood why roads are lumped in with that, because with the mechanism of toll booths, you can exclude people. And I mean, they are rivalrous, because if I'm driving and taking up, multiple lanes of traffic, other people can't use them. So it just seems like infrastructure doesn't fit the basic definition of a public good.
Yeah. So it's a great point. And I would say two things from there. So economists being economists like to complicate sometimes non-complicated things. And so there are public goods, but they have this other, like a platonic ideal of a public good that they call a pure public good. Right. And so that's something like national defense or clean air, light, or something like that. So you're very right that roads are not a pure public good, in that they are excludable and they are rivalrous, right? That you have congestion. But the other thing I would say too is that I think they were more of a public good in earlier decades, and especially earlier centuries. I guess, when did cars come about? In the early 1900s. Because the governments lacked kind of the technological capacity to very efficiently and low costly price these things if they were to offload it to the private sector. Whereas now, if you look at for example, there are a few cities that have incorporated congestion pricing. So Singapore, Stockholm, London, and I believe one more that I'm now forgetting. But if
Well,
you
New York City is on the verge of it.
Okay, well, I'll believe that when I see it. But for those three have it, and Singapore has had it since 1975. So
Oh, wow.
I'll use Singapore as the example. They price roads not just like a flat fee. London does a flat fee. Singapore does a variable fee that depends on the type of vehicle. So bigger vehicles charged more. The time of day, so rush hour charged more. The congestion in the area, right? The sensors. So it's called the ERP, the electronic road pricing. The sensors of the ERP sense how congested the particular road that the car is on and factor that into the variable price. And then there was one other factor that I'm now forgetting. But basically, Singapore's via technology has figured out how to turn roads from a public good into a private good. Essentially, right. They figured out how to price it very effectively and at low cost with this new technology that wasn't available to governments in the early 20th century.
Does the state handle all the infrastructure projects in Singapore, or is that contracted out?
I would imagine. I mean, so I know that Singapore is odd in that they are very pro-business, but I also know that their public housing is kind of odd around the world by public housing enthusiasts, because like something like 70 or 80%, a crazy proportion of their population lives in public housing. And so short answer is they're pretty private sector oriented, but then they have these certain sectors that are very dominated by the government. And that probably comes from Singapore's just geopolitical position as a tiny city state amidst, one of the key trading straits in Southeast Asia, that huge, gargantuan superpowers like China and, rising Indonesia and Japan all care about. So the government has to come in certain strategic sectors, and I guess housing is one of them.
It's really interesting. It's one of the things that motivates my interest in charter cities is just what can be accomplished when you're dealing with a political unit that's fairly small, and it becomes possible to internalize a lot of externalities and engage in the dynamic pricing you're discussing, and so build better infrastructure projects or incentivize better use of them. So I guess with that somewhat ham-fisted transition, let's get into the actual meat of the episode, which is charter cities. So you said that the Charter Cities Institute has these two main things that it's trying to do. You do consulting, and then you're also trying to lay the intellectual framework. So which one of those would you like to start getting into more?
Do you mean like for this episode, or more like the CCI, or as an organization, which one do we want to start getting into more?
Probably for this episode. Yeah.
Okay. Maybe let's chat about best give the intellectual framework first, okay. And then that gives everyone kind of something to frame the information around, and then we'll chat about specific projects. Sure. if we get to it.
Sounds good.
Should I go for it?
Yeah, please dive right in.
Yeah. So I mean, just for definitions at the top. So charter cities, they are new cities with new rules. So by rules, we mean policies, we mean laws, we mean institutions. And so why do we care about the rules? Institutions, so say a lot of economists and public policy folks, are one of the, if not the key determinant of long-run economic growth. And invariably around the world, a lot of low-income countries have poor institutions. Just one example is the World Bank's Doing Business Index. If you look at Sub-Saharan African average, on average, it takes about 37% of per capita income for the average country just to register business. And so, if that's the case, if you have that kind of stifled a business environment, you're not going to get a very dynamic entrepreneurial economy where investment is eager to come in invest in projects that it sees as fit. And so the question then becomes, if you have low-income countries that have poor governance, how do you turn around this poor governance? How do you engage in institutional change and institutional reform? And
So
we see,
just to quantify this, how many charter cities are there in the world right now?
yeah. So by our kind of strict definition, I would say Shenzhen is a proto charter city. I would say Hong Kong, Singapore, Dubai would be proto charter cities. But in terms of like these cities were not set out this way. I talked about Platonic ideals before. I would say we have this definition of what a charter city is, and there are varying degrees of it. Very much like there are varying degrees of decentralization. Some cities will be granted, a lot of autonomy, just like Shenzhen and Hong Kong were, and some will be granted less. And so there are varying degrees to which these cities would be considered by us as charter cities. So, but there's no pure charter cities by our definition.
So does Saudi Arabia's Neom project called The Line, does that fit into this?
So I know the Neom project, and I know, so there are a bunch of new cities like Neom currently being built or have been built. I think the number last I checked was there around 200 new city projects around the globe. And again, some of them have a lot of devolved autonomy and some of them don't. Some of them are or their policies are determined by higher tiers of government. And so that would vary the extent to which we consider them a charter city. I don't know about Neom's governance system just because I know it is a relatively new, I don't think it's been started being built, right? They're just conceiving of the concept. I saw the line drawing. I'm not sure how much of a fan I am of the line concept, but we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, that's a project that I was asked to come in and do some consulting on a couple of years ago. So that I'm familiar with it.
I mean, so I want to ask you then. So, like, what are your thoughts on Neom and its prospects?
Well, they wanted different rules to apply for parts of the country because they realized that Sharia law is not a very good economic development attractor, and so to bring multinational corporations to Saudi Arabia, they needed to create some sort of a platform that had different rules set behind it. And so both the king and his son both built palaces on the coast in the Neom area, right at the Red Sea there, and so now they're starting the work on the rest of it. So they got $500 billion they're trying to dedicate to this project.
Yeah. And that number kind of terrifies me because either like, that's a lot of money, right? So I worry about a lot of these projects and I don't know, for example, if you guys have seen Akon City, that's another like popular one, the music kind of stars going back to Senegal and giving back by founding this city. I saw some of the renderings of the planned project, and it looked to me like monumentalism a lot. And I worry that with $500 billion and a lot more where that came from in Saudi Arabia, that the project will kind of devolve or head that way in the area of monumentalism over practicality.
You mean just building giant garish structures because you've got the money to?
Exactly. Yeah. That aren't so much dedicated to function as just kind of, monuments to MBS or some other political authority.
As long as it fits on the line, no. It has to fit on the
line. Cannot stress how important the linear structure of this is.
No, I had to fly in there on a helicopter, which was quite the experience. That was a couple of years ago, so...
Yeah, I'm jealous. I'm always hopeful for these projects. I brought up Akon and I brought up the line and monumentalism as a potential thing that could get in the way. But like neither of these projects have gotten well underway for us to make any final judgments on them.
So as a futurist, I always think about kind of the long-term viability of these new structures. I mean, they're kind of, you're making up the rules as you go. Nothing's carved into stone for over time. So what do these look like 100 years from now, 200 years from now? And do they stand the test of time?
I think that if you go down the road of monumentalism, I don't think they will. I think that Shenzhen right now started off as I think it was 100 or 300,000 people spread out over, I believe it was 120 square kilometers, and it was basically a bunch of disparate fishing villages at the beginning in 1979, and then Deng Xiaoping engaged in this opening up and set up Shenzhen as one of the 4 original SEZs and liberalized these 4 SEZs. So the first land markets were formed, the first labor markets were formed, and they allowed foreign direct investment for the first time to enter into the country. And through this liberalization, you had this mass influx of folks from rural areas to urban areas. They became more educated, they became more productive, they engaged in gainful employment much more so than they were able to in rural areas. And then the Chinese Communist parties, kudos to them, they saw the success and they scaled and replicated it up to other cities across China. And now Shenzhen today is a city of, the metropolitan area is around 20 million. It's a huge metropolis, and it's it's called the Silicon Valley of hardware, I think. So it's one of the top manufacturing cities when it comes to hardware in the entire world. And so to me, like, if you've found a niche economically and you're able to adapt like Shenzhen is, because of the devolved authority they've gotten from the central level, that's the recipe for longevity, not, some statue of MBS that's made of stone or some Sphinx,
It'll be made of gold, I'm sure.
Yeah.
$500 billion you can spring for the gold statue.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's my, you need a local adaptation and an economic niche in order for longevity to be in the cards.
So I think we started that tangent when you were talking about institutions and the role that they play in charter cities.
Yes. So institutions good. A lot of low-income countries, institutions are bad. How do you change that status quo? And this problem was kind of chatted about by an economist named Mancur Olson, who wrote about the logic of collective action.
Right.
And when do you get a collective action problem? It's when there are concentrated benefits and dispersed costs. So what does that mean? I'll kind of explain. The common example is sugar tariffs in the US. I'm Canadian, so forgive me. I think it's Florida that has the bunch of sugar farmers, and these sugar farmers gain a ton from this sugar tariff being implemented, right? I think, let's say each gets $1 million a year from this sugar tariff. So they're super energized and incentivized to organize for this sugar tariff to stay in place, despite it being on the whole net bad for society.
Right.
Flip the coin to the consumer side. You and me, we go to the store, we maybe buy sugar like once every 6 months or once a year. And because of this tariff, it's like 15 cents or 20 cents extra. We're not getting all jazzed up and going to lobby our government to change this oppressive 15-cent tariff, right? It's the concentrated benefits to the farmers that get them jazzed up to organize to keep the tariff in place, whereas we're content with just kind of suffering the loss of the 15 cents, despite, again, it being net negative. I say this because you can make an analogous argument when it comes to institutional change, because you have political elites in a lot of these countries who benefit from the current institutions, despite them being suboptimal, right? Despite them being crappy institutions that are net bad for the country as a whole, they're going to fight to keep that in place so that their rents are continued. They continue to stream towards them, and conversely, the citizens on the whole, maybe they're disrupted, once a month or something like that for a petty bribe. They're not going to get all hyped up and organized most of the time. And so that's the problem that you have with institutional change. And so what are the solutions? We see it at the Charter Cities Institute as localizing the problem, right? National level institutional reforms, you bump up against all of these elites, these special interests that stymie reform. So you localize the problem and you undercut all of those, or at least get rid of all those special interests that you bump up against. And then another way to do that too, in addition to localizing, is you set up these new jurisdictions, these new cities on greenfield land, so sparsely populated land. And because there are very few people there, there's very few kind of special interests, elite interests that you're bumping up against and jeopardizing. And so you're able to get a lot deeper institutional reforms than otherwise possible. And so that's what we see charter cities as a mechanism to do.
I think it might be worth exploring this relationship between institutions and long-term prosperity, and then I promise after that we'll get to specific charter city stuff. But like, why is it that institutions are so important to a country's well-being?
Yeah, so it's important to institutions. Like Douglas North was the big institutional economist, and institutions are both formal, so codified laws, and informal practices, customs, beliefs. And they're so important because they structure, both formal and informal institutions structure all of our social and private interactions in everyday life. And by structuring all of those interactions, whether it's a formal rule like a law or an informal, taboo or something like don't spit in public, it's those structuring of our everyday interactions that provide us as individuals with incentives to either engage in good behavior or allow and permit bad behavior. And so that's why they're so important, because when you then aggregate up from the individual level to the societal level, and you have a rule set, an institutional set that nudges each individual on the margin towards good behavior and less permits bad behavior, then you're going to get better outcomes. And so that's, I guess, simplifying it a lot. That's why institutions, to me and to a lot of other economists, are the single greatest determinant of long-run economic growth.
Yeah. So would your organization benefit or not benefit from an episode on Black Mirror about charter cities?
So
it would depend on the direction they took it, I think.
Yeah, and just judging from the few episodes I've seen. So I watched that in the middle of COVID, and I was like, I can't watch this anymore. This is too depressing. This is like bumming me out, seriously. So I would assume that Black Mirror would take charter cities to some horrible dystopian end. So I would, while we would relish the name recognition, we might have some reputational damage to the idea. Yeah.
So how does citizenship change, or does it at all, crossing the borders into a charter city?
Yeah. So this would all, I mean, we're pretty agnostic as to, right, there can be public run charter cities, there can be public private charter cities, there can be private charter cities, and we're pretty agnostic as to the form that ultimately comes about. We just really advocate for devolved as much devolved authority as the city can get. We do push for a public-private partnership model, a PPP model. And when we talk about Romer's model versus ours, I'll get into it more. But to answer your question, there will be a negotiation phase about what the city charter actually entails, number one. And there will be a negotiation phase for enacting at the national level of that host country legislation that sets up the legal framework for these charter cities. And typically in both of them, those documents, those legal documents will delineate whether that charter city has been given the authority over something like immigration and visas and things like that. What we write in the handbook is that because we want free flowing both goods and people, free movement of both between the charter city and the host country, it's going to be most likely, again, we're pretty agnostic about how this ends up, but we think it's going to be most likely that immigration will end up being a branch of the National Immigration Service that's deconcentrated to the charter city and set up there. And we advocate that then the city manager of the charter city appoints the head of the charter city's branch of the National Immigration Service that's there. That's what we recommend in the handbook based on our reading of the literature and chatting with new city projects on the ground. But again, there will be various forms of this that crop up as more and more cities get started.
So how do you feel about the current landscape of charter cities? I was recently reading the prospectus on Prospera on Astral Codex 10, and he goes into a bunch of detail about the way the city's laid out and how the laws are going to work. And there's a lot of really fascinating stuff there. So among the projects that are currently out there, are there any that really stand out as being especially promising that you're especially excited to see unfold?
Yeah. So there are, I would say, two that we're affiliated with. And so on Prospera, you might ask about this, but I'll just bring it up now because you mentioned it. So one of the chief critiques of charter cities, and I mean, I think it's a fair critique. You know, I'm a researcher. When I read something that's fair, you know, I'll give you, it's fair. And one of them is that, and this is Sarah Moser is a geographer from McGill University. She works a lot on new city developments around the globe. Like I said, there's some 200 odd new city developments. And she writes about in a lot of her work how a lot of these new cities become kind of enclaves for the rich and are sort of bastions of inequality. And, you know, this is fair because like that's what a lot of these projects, you know, are. And I see, I place no value judgment on that, by the way, but CCI is dedicated. Our mission is to lift tens of millions of people out of poverty. And so we're focused on a sort of different model of charter cities that really focus on low income segments. And so I think Prosper has taken another route. They're focused on, it sounds like remote work and getting, I guess, more high income folks, digital nomads to come in, and they have this beautiful tropical island on Roatan in Honduras. They have a low tax rates and all that stuff, and they can come there and have a glorious time in the tropics. And so that's kind of this higher income model. Again, it's fine. They're experimenting with different rules. That experimentation is good. People learn from that experimentation. You can see sort of what works and what doesn't. As you said, they have some like really interesting stuff on the books that Scott Alexander wrote about. It's just not, you know, given our mission and the fact we're a nonprofit, it's not the model that we're super interested in. We want kind of the low income segment to be the front and center.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that then. What's the model that you specifically advocate for, and how is it that you think that will lift all these people out of poverty?
Yeah. So, and so our model is, like I said, a public-private partnership model, and this differentiates it from Paul Romer's model. You guys probably he had this famous TED talk
Right.
back in 2009, where he first, I don't want to say introduced because charter cities as a concept actually has a very long history, but he, I guess, reintroduced it to the world. And the way he conceived of it was uh, charter cities would be established in these host countries, and then these host countries would get this foreign guarantor country to come in and rule these jurisdictions. So it'd be like, for example, Honduras. Canada would come into Honduras and rule a particular delimited geographic area within
Like a
Honduras
Canada
with
franchise.
exactly
in
with
Honduras.
Canadian laws and Canadian rules and stuff, and it'd be great. Obviously, I think for some pretty apparent reasons that smacked some folks of white savior syndrome. Is these guys in like Western capitals coming in and saving the day, and smacked others of neocolonialism. Like, we've done this before. I don't want to go into that too much, but basically it became politically unfeasible, and I would say even undesirable from a legitimacy point of view. And Paul Romer tried this model in Honduras. It didn't really. He left the project. This was, I believe, in 2012 or 2013. There was a constitutional crisis, and then they had the law got struck down by the Constitutional Court. They had to rejig the law. They passed this new ZETI legislation, and then it took another 8 years for ZETIs to actually form. So Prosper is, I think, the first one, and then we have an affiliated project called Ciudad Morazan. That's another one. And then the other project he worked on was in Madagascar, and again, that didn't take off. The president, I want to say he got ousted in a coup. I think that's what happened. But basically, the incumbent got booted out, and he no longer had political support. And so this is all to say that he got the conversation started again. So kudos to Romer for that. But I think the model that he proposed was slightly off. So we propose instead a public-private partnership model. So that's kind of the host country being the public entity, partnering with a ideally local urban developer, real estate developer from the private sector. And the mechanism that aligns incentives is that the urban developer, by kind of having control over this particular jurisdiction, they are incentivized to maximize land values, right? And so what increases land values? It's when there's more economic activity. It's when more residents move to the zone. It's when more businesses are started up in the zone. And so, if their incentive is to maximize land values, then that's what should be the incentive of all governments, right? That spurring economic activity should be the be all end all of these governments. And so we think that aligns incentives better. And I think I explained that well enough. It's the private developers' incentives are aligned because they are incented to maximize land values, and by doing so, they maximize their profits, and at the same time as increase economic activity in the jurisdiction. And so we think that's a more desirable, feasible, and tenable alternative to Romer's model.
So one of the big shifts globally is that most of the countries in the world have stopped having kids, and there's only 6 countries in the world that have over half of all the babies born in the world right now. And it's occurred to me that this being the case, that very likely we're going to see a much larger issue with refugees coming out of poor countries, moving around the world. Is there a way that charter cities can work with some of the refugee issues that are going on right now and solve some of the problems?
I would say absolutely. In fact, this is good timing for this question. We have Alexander Betts, who is a professor at Oxford. He just came out with a book called The Wealth of Refugees, and he wrote a book with Paul Collier, who's an economist, called Refuge. I think that was in 2013 or 2014. Coming on our podcast, this is in 2 days, so I have some reading to do. But we also recently put out our own paper on this, how charter cities can help with refugee responses. And the main route for charter cities to help in this area, I think, is the statistic says that 78% of refugees are in a form of protracted displacement. That means they've been displaced from their homes for at least 5 years, typically over 5 years. And yet, the UNHCR, which is the High Commission for Refugees, guys responsible for all these responses, they are still acting like these are short-term issues. That's why we still see refugee camps. And this is despite these folks being displaced for longer than 5 years. And so if we have almost 80% of refugees in this kind of protracted situation, there needs to be some thought towards long-term urban management, right? These are large agglomerations of people. When they become refugees, a lot of countries refuse to grant them the right to work, and yet they're then forced to be in this situation for 5+ years. It seems like an absurd Kafkaesque kind of catch-22 that these refugees are in, right? And so we see the solution as, again, letting this zone, this particular delimited jurisdiction that is, if it's an existing thing, it's a refugee camp. If it's a new one, hopefully you can contract with an urban management company to come in and plan at least somewhat in advance of mass settlement. That way costs are lowered. And you provide this jurisdiction with the right to work for the refugees in in that jurisdiction and to integrate with the host country. And so we lay out some other ways that charter cities can help out in this realm. But I think that's really the key one, is switching refugee responses from the current status quo, which is very emergency, short-term oriented, that UNHCR is currently engaged in, to realizing the facts on the ground dictate that this is a longer-term problem and we need to be planning accordingly.
So would it mostly be setting up a charter city that has different laws to account for the people that are there? Do you like sort of wrap them in a charter city, like a refugee camp?
So two things, two important things. One is UNHCR to this day maintains most of the authority over the provision of waste management, constructing and keeping the roads clear, importing or implementing sewage, water, and all this stuff. They are not meant to do that. Right. They are a UN agency meant to and established to advocate on behalf of migrants and refugees. They are not an urban management company. And yet they are carrying out and continue to carry out these functions that they weren't made to do. So these things could be done a lot more efficiently. That's number one. Number two is most refugees are denied the right to work. And so they're forced into these because they need to make a living. They need to eat themselves and provide food for their kids. So they're forced into these situations of precarity where they are in informal work. Sometimes it's unspeakable types of work. And so we need to start to recognize their right to formal employment and allow integration with businesses and enterprises from the host country to come in and provide goods and services, sell their own wares, and therefore themselves gain by integrating economically with these these populations. And so, yeah, formal work and I guess getting the UNHCR to give up the urban management game.
to stop doing a job they were never intended to do and aren't handling all that well.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Do they seem receptive to the ideas that you have or the work that you've done?
No.
It's a one-word answer. Okay.
Yeah. So for this paper, it was written by a great graduate student at the London School of Economics in migration and public policy. Her name's Sarah Doyle. She spoke to a bunch of practitioners, including, I think she spoke to some folks at UNHCR who wanted to remain anonymous for the paper for, I think, obvious reasons. But one of the people she interviewed for the paper was a guy named Kilian Kleinschmidt. And he was basically declared, quote unquote, the mayor of Zatari, which was one of the biggest refugee camps in Syria. And so this urban management point, the fact that it makes absolutely zero sense for an entity like UNHCR to be involved in this stuff, that came from his own frustrations. And from the way Sarah relayed that conversation to me, it got quite animated. Wow. And because the guy experienced this stuff and the frustrations that come with prolonged incompetence firsthand, right? And you know, I think he's German. That, you know, he goes home at the end of the day, but he then had to watch as other people in desperate, vulnerable circumstances had to be the ones who dealt with the consequences of this very fixable problem. And so I think that that radicalized him a bit. And so he's advocating for a very, very similar idea called special development zones. For all intents and purposes, we could see our paper as advocating for an analogous concept when it comes to refugees. And Kilian is a great guy, so I highly recommend that.
So most of the refugee camps in the world are in Turkey, aren't they, or a large percentage of them?
I am not sure about most in the world, but I know Turkey is definitely a hotspot, a haven, just because it's the kind of border between Europe and the Middle East and West Asia, right? Yeah. So, yeah.
And their government really doesn't want to deal with the refugees, so they're there because they have nowhere else to go, and then the UN is providing money for them. Is that correct? Or some sort of sense in supplies or support or something.
I'm not sure. I don't know as much about the Turkish context. I do know that, you know, they're far from the only kind of culprits in this realm. I know that, for example, we're writing a paper on the issues in Libya. And I know that there's this migrant route from Niger and northern Nigeria up through the Sahara to Libya. I know that a lot of those migrants don't make it or turn back or get forced into, you know, human trafficking situations. Some of them do make it and then make the precarious journey from the coast of Libya across the Mediterranean Sea. Again, some of them drown. And when they get there, Italy, a lot of the times, puts them back.
Right.
And so it's to say that, like, the whole of Europe is a lot of the culprit, but it's not just kind of one country or another. It's a tough issue, and this is why I think, like, again, localizing the problem below the national level will allow us to experiment with some more better and feasible policy alternatives.
Yeah, I see all these young people growing up mostly in Africa where they're still having lots of kids, and they all seem to have access to smartphones over there. and they're looking at their smartphones and they're saying, "Wow, there's some really fascinating stuff going on around the world, but it's not happening here. I think I'll just go there." And they have very little risk to just pick up and leave and travel around the world. And it's not a movement of a group of people. It might be just a couple buddies that are just take off and on a lark and decide to travel around the world and end up somewhere. I see this happening with far greater frequency moving forward. This problem is not going to go away. I think it gets progressively worse over time.
Yeah, and so I would, because like the stuff, the literature I've read on the immigration, especially the Libyan route that I talked about, there are a ton of risks. And I know, for example, the German government is funding studies right now to figure out how do we kind of like humanely stem this tide from coming to Europe. We're Germans, right? We don't want to engage in what the Italians are doing. It's like hideous, but like we still don't want migrants. Right. So how do we stop this from happening? And one of the things they've realized in this study, right? You mentioned the smartphones. This is why I'm bringing this up. It's survivor bias, right? Because you're only hearing great things from the people that arrive in Germany or Italy and are taking pictures of the Colosseum or the Berlin Wall and sending it on WhatsApp to their friends back home.
Right.
And the German government is trying to hit their head against a wall to figure out how to get migrants who have made it over and gone through a horrible experience, which a lot of them go through, how to get those people to communicate back home that, guys, it's not all Colosseums and Berlin Walls and tourism. It's like a horribly risky journey. I've just gone through it. Please don't go. But those guys, the negative stories get sent via WhatsApp a lot less than the positive stories. And so there's this survivorship bias that makes it distorts the risks that these folks are taking on when they decide to leave. And the German government is trying to figure out how to convey accurate risks such that fewer people decide to go in the first place.
All right, so we are coming up on the hour here, and I know that you wanted to talk a little bit about the Governance Handbook that the CCI has just put out. So it's 250 pages, and you graciously sent it to me 2 hours ago to read in advance of the episode. So I'm going to repay the favor and give you 5 or so minutes to summarize the entire thing. Go.
So this is my bad, and thank you for bringing it up alive. Again, my research team, one of our main roles is to set the sort of intellectual foundations for charter cities. The other role is to provide consulting technical assistance to new projects on the ground. This project very much marries both of those arms of research because it's very practically oriented. We wrote it for specifically for new city builders, new city developers in mind, and so we hope that it both sets forward a vision of what this legal framework for new cities could be, as well as is a practical step-by-step guide to create a legal system from scratch. And so I guess first what would help maybe is just explaining the motivation, the why behind the project. And so, right, we have these 200 or so new cities being developed around the world. We have urban planning firms that are hired to make the master plans for these cities. We have architecture firms hired to design them, engineering firms to construct them. What we don't have is kind of these firms dedicated to setting up and directing the new legal system for these new cities. And so that's exactly what the gap that the handbook was meant to sort of fill. And it's 16 chapters, as you alluded to. It is 250 pages. We chatted with, I think, around 50 practitioners and academics specialists in each of these 16 regulatory domains, to both, talk to academics to get at the research frontier of what's kind of impractical, but like they think, should be implemented, and then talk to practitioners to see what's possible within that kind of rosy picture that the academic just painted. So we tried to arrive at very actionable, feasible policy recommendations, and I think we did a good job. And so what are these?
So if somebody wants a copy of this, how would they get a hold of it?
So it's going to be published here. It'll probably be published by the time this podcast comes out. I don't know what your guys' turnaround time is, but it'll be published here. It's May 18th, within the next week or so, I would imagine. So I'd say by June 1st at the very latest. So that would be available on our website. There's a reference guide section of our website, and we'll put it out on all of our social media channels and all that fun stuff too. So it's available via that. That's it. And I guess maybe I'll butt off. There's a very little time, but I'll butt off some of the main critiques to this, because I know our main audience is new city builders. A secondary audience is the international development community. And one of the main critiques we got when we did our due diligence and did the kind of 50 odd interviews is, things are very context specific. You can't really make a handbook like this. The projects are too different. And while I totally concede context specificity, every locality is different, and that's totally true. I do not concede that that should render you,
that there are no principles at all, right?
Exactly.
Then it would be impossible to do anything.
Exactly. That should not render you inactive. There are lessons from the past that we can learn, and these lessons can be brought together in a sort of collated, centralized document and communicated in a simple way. And so that's what this handbook tries to do. I think it's the first kind of comprehensive attempt at this, and I hope that new city builders find it useful. If you have further questions, new city builders, international development folks can reach out to me, Kurtis at cci.city, and we can have a chat about it.
Well, there you have it. How to start your own charter city in 5 easy steps.
Yeah. 16 easy steps.
16 chapters, 250 pages.
Right.
Yes.
Well, fantastic. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, this has been great, guys. Thanks so much.
Yeah, this is great. Thanks.